Good evening. Good evening and welcome to this conference commemorating the 70th anniversary of D-Day, the largest amphibious operation in the history of humankind. My name is Peter Hahn. I'm chair of the History Department here at Ohio State. It's my distinct pleasure to welcome each of you to campus or back to campus for this conference. As you know, we will continue tomorrow with 3 academic lectures on various aspects of D-Day, as well as a lunchtime display of World War II documents and artifacts at Thompson Library. And then in the late afternoon, a special session featuring pre-combat veterans of World War II. It's my sincere hope that this conference, beginning with our keynote lecture this evening, enhances your knowledge and understanding about this momentous event in human history, in U.S. and world history, and your appreciation for the brave citizens who sacrificed so much for the nation during its time of crisis. This conference would not be possible without the fantastic support of the Office of University Development, with the College of Arts and Sciences Offices of Development and Communications, and the faculty and staff of the History Department. I'm deeply appreciative of the many people involved behind the scenes in pulling it all together. I also wish sincerely to thank the numerous friends of the History Department whose generous donations have enabled us freely to offer this commemorative conference to the people of Ohio. To each and every one of you whose names are printed on the program and have also appeared through the reception on the screen, thank you so much for your support that has enabled us to fulfill our mandate as a land-grant institution to edify the citizens of the state. Allow me now to introduce our keynote speaker for this Remembering D-Day conference. Dr. Williamson Murray, Mick Murray, is Professor Emeritus of History at Ohio State, and he's currently serving as an academic program fellow at the Potomac Institute. Wick graduated from Yale University in 1963 with honors in history. He served for 5 years in the U.S. Air Force as an officer, including a tour in Southeast Asia. He then returned to Yale, where he earned his PhD in military and diplomatic history, and then he joined the faculty in the Ohio State History Department, where he taught for nearly 2 decades. Wick is the author of many acclaimed historical works on the Second World War, the theory of military history, military innovation, and warfare in the modern world. One of Wick's most distinguished publications, entitled A War to be Won, Fighting the Second World War, 1937 to 1945, will be on sale tomorrow following the Veterans Panel. This evening, Dr. Murray will present a lecture entitled The Eve of D-Day, Possibilities and Roads Not Taken. Please join me now in welcoming him to this podium. Wick.
Let me say, I'm delighted to be back here at Ohio State. I come back occasionally to lecture undergraduates and talk to graduate students, but it's really nice to have a crowd of older people and many of my former students who wandered in, clearly not having enough of me during. Let me begin by just sort of paying tribute to one of what Tom Brokaw called the greatest generation, who was not at D-Day, but was in fact a lieutenant in the United States Navy who would complete his career in 1945 in the U.S. Navy by taking a destroyer escort back to the continental United States as the commander of that ship, Wayne Woodrow Hayes. A man who I got to know after he had been fired as a football coach here and spent about 4 or 5 years with him in his office where I would attempt to discuss football and he would have no intention of discussing football, but want to talk about history, which we invariably talked about. In fact, along those lines, in terms of honoring Coach Hayes, a little story that I think kind of sums up many of the people in this generation. On the last day of his life, I took Professor Donald Kagan of Yale University, a PhD from Ohio State, in 1959, to have breakfast with Woody. We picked him up at his house in Upper Arlington. Woody's first comment was, "Is this a Japanese car?" It was, but I kind of muttered under my breath, and Woody didn't hear very well. So actually, Woody, on the last day of his life, actually rode in a Japanese car. We went to breakfast. Donald Kagan, who was a great sports fan, was and is, because he's still alive and his mind is still sharp. Donald Kagan and I wanted to talk about football with Woody. We had no intention about talking about football, although we did get a little bit of that. He wanted to talk about history, and for 2.5 hours we talked about history. We got some wonderful stories about Woody's background, but I won't go through those. Maybe during the after period I can address some of those. But at the end of the breakfast, we had an argument about who was going to pay. The two professors were going to pay for Woody, and Woody was going to pay for the professors. And once again, we lost the argument. Woody stood up. And the manager came over and said, as Woody said, "Here's the money for the breakfast." The manager said, "Oh, no, Coach Hayes, we're going to pay for it. It's on us." And Woody looked and said, "You can't do that." The manager said, "We can do that." With which Woody paused for about 2 seconds and took the $40 for about a $21 bill, as I remember it, threw it down on the table and said, "This is a tip then," and walked out. And I think the moral of the story, for those of you who knew Woody, was that Woody was not going to have a free breakfast, much less a free lunch. I'm going to talk today about some of the, if you will, aspects of D-Day that didn't happen. And that as a consequence resulted in the success of the 6th of June, which was, you could use the same wonderful epitaph for that the Duke of Wellington used for his victory at Waterloo. It was the closest run thing you ever saw in your life. And I think it's well to remember in terms of D-Day and the extraordinary sacrifices that were made by Allied seamen and sailors. And I said seamen in terms of the merchant sailors, because for those of you who have been to Normandy, you've seen the Danish, Norwegian statue that's there for the merchant sailors who died off of the coast of Normandy. Sailors, soldiers, and airmen who died from a variety of nations, United States, Canada, and Great Britain most obviously, but some Frenchmen and others as well. I think in terms of really understanding history and its difficulties and complexities, you really have to understand that in looking at it from our perspective, it seems all too easy and all too obvious in terms of the outcome. That what happened, happened because it was ordained. And we miss, if you will, the roads not taken and the fact that those who were making decisions in the period before the 6th of June faced a considerable number of uncertainties and ambiguities and difficulties. And in the choices they made, they could have taken other roads which might have not worked out so well. Moreover, I think something which we don't like to recognize and like to admit is the fact that what Thucydides called Tyche, chance, has an enormous impact on the events that happen in history in the past and which will happen in the future. And Tyche is more than chance. It is, as Don Kagan described it to me, it represents surprising events which not in the normal course of history should have happened. And chance hung over the events of the 6th of June, as did the decisions, competent and incompetent, on both sides that affected the possibilities open to those who would do the fighting that day. And so that is my purpose. It is also my purpose to, if you will, examine what Winston Churchill, in talking about the Dardanelles campaign of 1915, called the terrible ifs. If only this had not happened, if only that had not happened, the whole course of the Dardanelles campaign would have been different. In the case of Normandy, the terrible ifs, for the most part, did not happen. And as a result, across the board, the 5 great landings plus the 2 great airborne landings succeeded well enough, and that's a phrase that the British strategist Colin Gray uses, were good enough to succeed and place Allied forces on the shores of France in sufficient strength so that the break into Hitler's atrocious and terrible empire would succeed. Let me begin in terms of, if you will, the ifs of the past by underlining that chance has a huge impact on that, and the fact that the 3 crucial figures at the very top of the Allied and opposing forces in 1944 were there quite surprisingly. Adolf Hitler was present as a basic combat infantryman at the Battle of Langemarck in November of 1914, a battle in which out of 36,000 German troops, 30,000 were killed or maimed, untouched. And Adolf Hitler then succeeded in surviving the Second World War as a combat runner in the German army on the Western Front from 1914 to 1918. And given what we know about the level of casualties in the First World War, his very survival throughout the First World War was clearly a matter of extraordinary chance and luck. But I think we could say the same for the 2 Allied leaders who were so important, if you will, for reasons that I will set out. In the case of Franklin Roosevelt, polio laid him low in the early 1920s. That polio could well have killed him because of an extraordinary severe case that left him crippled for the rest of his life, so that quite literally he could never walk again without the help of someone else, or without the help of crutches and a wheelchair. But he also survived an assassination attempt in 1932 in which the individual fired several pistol shots which killed the mayor of Miami, who was sitting next to Roosevelt. And one suspects that the individual carrying out the assassination attempt hoped to kill Roosevelt and thought he was killing Roosevelt, but in fact killed the wrong person. And I would argue with you that without Roosevelt, Normandy would not have occurred. The United States would not have entered the Second World War. And here we confront, if you will, the legend which has a certain amount of truth in it, that Franklin Roosevelt deliberately and with malice aforethought led the United States into the Second World War. The part of it that's true is that Roosevelt, I think, recognized the terrible evil and danger that Nazi Germany represented, particularly after the fall of France in 1940, and did everything he could, if you will, to support both Britain and the Soviet Union. Any other American politician of the time that we know of, it's inconceivable that such an individual would have taken, if you will, the political risks that Roosevelt took in the summer of 1940 to begin arming the Brits with everything the United States had, which wasn't much, by the way. It's hard for us to remember how badly armed and badly equipped and with virtually no capabilities the American military in summer 1940 possessed. And yet Roosevelt, of course, against the advice of his senior military advisors, persisted in that course of sending significant military aid to Great Britain beginning in the fall of 1940, when it was clear to him that Britain was not going to fall. And of course, his effort to open the gates began in the summer of 1940. The third individual, of course, is Winston Churchill. Obviously, Britain's greatest leader in retrospect, greatest strategist, one of Britain's greatest historians, at least in a popular sense, although he'd never get tenure and so you confront the question of why did it take so long for Churchill to reach the top in May 1940 when virtually everything had gone down the drain. In fact, he was appointed Prime Minister of Britain on the 10th of May 1940 when the German panzers came west against the French and the Belgians and the Luxembourgers and the Dutch, of course. Part of it, of course, was that Churchill had an extraordinary wit, which I think in political terms was quite useful. My favorite story, and again, those undergraduates, former undergraduates heard this story, and graduate students, Russell Hart is here, one of my former undergraduates. Dan, you know, back there, heard this story, but it's a great one, and most of you never taken a course from me, so you get to hear what I think is the funniest story that Churchill ever did. My wife has heard it 18 million times. I'm really tired of it. My mother-in-law has not, for obvious reasons, which you'll understand in a minute. In April of 1938, Churchill was giving a great oration in the House of Commons about how Britain needed more air defense. Certainly very perceptive, right on the mark. But in the middle of his oration, one of the backbenchers, who could have come from any of the parties, given the political attitudes at the time, shouted out, "How much is enough?" Which Churchill paused and said, "Well, that reminds me of the story of the man from Brazil who received a telegram which said, 'Your mother-in-law dead, wire instructions.'" Churchill paused a minute and said, "And so the man wired back, 'Embalm, cremate, bury at sea, take no chances.'" That kind of, if you will, repartee will not get you in too much trouble in the political arena. The problem was that Churchill used this enormous capacity for repartee in, if you will, the personal arena with leading members of both his own party and the opposition. Again, along those lines, a story that many of you may have heard, but still a great story. Having breakfast with Lady Astor in 1938, a leading appeaser. They had a vicious argument across the breakfast table, and she finally gasped, "Mr. Churchill, if you were my wife, I would poison your coffee." Without pausing, Churchill said, "Madam, if you were my wife, I would drink it." But I think we also have to understand that, again, in terms of chance, Churchill's presence as British Prime Minister beginning on the 10th of May 1940 depended to a considerable extent on chance. He exposed himself eagerly and with great delight on a number of battlefields. Northwest India, the area that we now know as Pakistan, where the Taliban hangs out, the Sudan, South Africa, all of those Churchill wandered around the battlefield, both as an officer and as a reporter and author. He had a 6-month extent as a battalion commander on the Western Front in 1916. Not a particularly dangerous area, the front, as he admitted, but still, any time on the Western Front in 1916, chance was always waited for those who were unwary or unlucky, and luckily Churchill was neither. And then, of course, the closest brush with death came in 1931 when a car in New York City off of Fifth Avenue, Churchill stepped out to cross the street without looking to his left, instead of looking in terms of sort of the normal habit that one acquires as a Brit, to look to the right. And the result was that he was hit severely enough, put him in the hospital and put off his lecture tour for a while. I think it's pretty clear if Churchill had stepped off, it was a glancing blow, by the way, if he had stepped off 1 second earlier and gotten hit squarely, there's a good chance that he would have been permanently injured or killed. And finally, in terms of taking over as Prime Minister on the 10th of May, 1940, it's worth noting that Chamberlain, facing a political crisis in Britain at precisely the right time, in early May 1940, decided that he had to resign, which he did, and offered the job to Lord Halifax first, instead of Churchill. And Lord Halifax, for a variety of reasons that are rather complex, turned it down. Churchill accepted Chamberlain's offer, and as they say, the rest is history. But I think it's well worth remembering that both Churchill and Roosevelt were in their positions to influence and guide British and American strategy in very successful directions by chance. And what was, of course, crucial in the summer of 1940 was that not only did Churchill provide, if you will, the wisdom to understand that Nazi Germany represented an extraordinary strategic and moral danger. Both. Very few people in Europe understood that, or the United States for that matter. But recognizing that danger, took, if you will, the famous stand to give those extraordinary speeches, which marked his prime ministership in 1940. Never in the field of human affairs has so many owed so much to so few. And of course, no matter how eloquent and how brilliant those speeches might be, they would never appear in a university course. What he was also able to do was to understand that in the long term, Germany had only won a if you will, fleeting strategic operational victory, which changed, if you will, the strategic dynamics of the European war, but had not changed, if you will, the long-term fact that neither the United States nor the Soviet Union could really stand for Germany dominating the European continent, which it would have done if Britain had surrendered. And the result of that was that Churchill reached out to both the United States and the Soviet Union in 1940. The Soviet Union had no interest in that reaching out. An extraordinarily wretched story of misperceptions and it would not be until the German invasion of the Soviet Union had taken care of that problem on the 22nd of June 1941 that suddenly the Soviet Union found itself in a war against Germany, the same war that the British were facing. Churchill's success with the United States was far better. The problem that Roosevelt confronted was both he was running for president of the United States for a third term, which a substantial number of the American people really had doubts and questions about, the only individual to do so in American history. And he had to be extraordinarily careful in terms of what he was willing to do. And I think here, in fairness to Churchill, he pushed the envelope as far as he dared to do, without, if you will, harming the long-term political leadership that he would possess in the United States. And so while Churchill might have hoped that the United States would enter the war sometime in 1941, earlier rather than later, it turned out to be later, and it took the extraordinary help of the Japanese in one of the most idiotic acts of tactical brilliance but strategic idiocy in terms of the Pearl Harbor attack to get the United States in the war. And then we might mention that to compound the stupidity of the situation, the Germans then declared war on the United States. So, what was Allied strategy going to be, and what sorts of things influenced, if you will, the landing of the 6th of June, 1944? The first I want to emphasize, and I'm going to spend much time talking about it, although your questions might come along this line, was the role of intelligence. The fact that the British began breaking into the German codes, highest levels, strategic codes, Army, Navy, and Air Force codes in 1940, and continued with varying success throughout the Second World War. In terms of understanding the success in Normandy, you have to understand that the breaking of those codes played a crucial role in supporting the deception efforts to persuade the Germans that the main Allied landing was going to come in the Pas-de-Calais rather than in Normandy. And that effort continued right through to August of 1944, when finally the Germans' lines broke. Helping that fact was that the British managed to arrest every single German agent in the United Kingdom and either hang them or, if they were willing to play, to use them as a double agent to feed information to the Germans. And again, in terms of German stupidity, and I have to suggest to you, German stupidity in the Second World War was really quite extraordinary. In fact, the Germans managed to repeat every single strategic mistake they had made in the First World War. And when you repeat every single mistake you made before, it certainly suggests something about the learning curve. In August of 1944, when the breakout occurred and no landing had occurred on the Pas-de-Calais, the Allied managers of these agents who used Alter to read what the Germans and then feed the Germans messages that confirmed their assumptions were quite worried that the Germans would wake up. And so they sent Germans several messages saying that the German efforts to defend Pas-de-Calais had been so successful that the Allies had finally given up and put all their effort into Normandy. With which the Germans then replied by congratulating the agents, the double agents who were working for the British, on their brilliant efforts to support the Third Reich and awarding them all Iron Crosses, which undoubtedly they awarded at cocktail parties in the Third Reich's successor. Let me spend a few minutes to turn to the debates that took place between Churchill, between the British and the Americans in 1942 and 1943. The most important debate that took place was over whether we should land in 1942 or not. It was a non-goer from the very beginning because neither we nor the Brits had the adequate military power, but we played along on that with the Americans pushing for it. And finally the Brits said, no, the only possibility is an invasion of North Africa. The two senior American advisors to Franklin Roosevelt, Admiral Ernest King and George C. Marshall, great figures, but they sent Roosevelt a memo that said, hey, Chief, we should forget the Brits and send everything to the Pacific and not do North Africa the way they're suggesting. And for one of the few times in his career, one of the great frustrations, and Professor Houghton faces this in his research, in anybody working in the Roosevelt archives discovered that Franklin Roosevelt put no fingerprints on anything. He signed no documents. He told people different things, and to actually figure out what he was doing is almost impossible. Almost impossible. This case, though, however, he sent them back a memorandum saying, you will do the landing in North Africa, signed Franklin Roosevelt, Commander-in-Chief. That was a message they understood. And so the landing in North Africa took place. Now, one of the interesting things that's happened in terms of historical debates is for 40 years, historians paying no attention to documents, again, in terms of what a sloppy profession we are. So we have no right, I would argue, to suggest other professions are sloppy, but a very sloppy profession. The conventional wisdom has been that there was a huge debate in Casablanca in which Marshall argued for an invasion of France in 1943 and no commitment to the Mediterranean. And the documents actually make clear a couple things which nobody had paid any attention to. The most important debate was not at Casablanca. The most important debate in terms of American strategy, which was crucial to doing Normandy successful, occurred in October 1942 between a couple of New Deal economists who had played a crucial role in developing the first rather questionable efforts to measure GDP and what actually an economy could do. And the military supply guys that were responsible for building up the U.S. Army and who were urging the creation of a 200-division army. And what basically the economist said is that if you try and build a 200-division army, given the commitment, the President's commitment to both the Navy and the Army Air Forces, which he's not going to change for both political and other reasons, if you do that, you will not have an army capable of landing in Europe in 1944. And beyond that, if you want to have an army capable of if you will, a landing successfully in Europe, 100 divisions is about the best you're going to get, which is precisely what the economy proved capable. Now that fight went all the way to the President, not signed documents, but I think the evidence is pretty clear that the two New Deal economists who worked very closely with Harry Hopkins won the fight, and the only reason that Harry Hopkins and his economists would have won the fight was because the President said, you will. And again, this is one of those things where, again, Roosevelt, there's nothing there. Nothing there you can find, but again, in terms of looking at the relative power, without his support, that would not have been. What's clear in terms of Casablanca is that Marshall understood that. And he did not argue for a landing in 43. He argued for a landing in 44 very clearly, but also for a minimization of the effort in the Mediterranean to Sicily and perhaps southern Italy, but not much beyond that because the buildup for the European invasion was going to have to happen in 1944. And what those arguments resulted, in terms of the British and Americans, I think is the best of all worlds. It is that if the British had won the arguments, we would have landed in Normandy with the British forces in 1948. If we had won the arguments, we might have tried to land in 43, and we would not have been capable of beating the Wehrmacht in 43 on the continent, nor would we have been capable of winning the air battles. Let me turn to the air power debates, and again, I'll try and sum them up. What's rather interesting about this, and this is where, again, history is so fascinating in terms of how sloppy we are. Here I can include myself. It's a wonderful article of the Journal of Military History that has just come out, which indicates that the Spitfire could have been a long-range fighter by 1941. It could have gone all the way to Berlin and challenged Bf-109s over Berlin and supported British bombing during the day. But the culture and the arrogance of senior officers of the RAF was such that they completely undermined the possibility of turning the RAF into a long-range fighter, which almost happened in terms of the P-51. And I don't have time to get into all of those fascinating stories, but the evidence is overwhelming, and the best evidence, again, that I paid no attention to, is that the Spitfire was turned into a long-range reconnaissance aircraft in 1941, which could go all the way to Berlin, take pictures all the way, actually, to Königsberg. The guns were removed from it, but fairly heavy cameras were put in, different fuel tanks were put in, and it clearly, you could have had a long-range Spitfire, and actually the U.S. Army Air Forces managed to take a couple of Spitfires. I got to tell the story. It's too wonderful in terms of cultural biases that the services have, which you can see today in the current American military at times. One of the senior American air officers from headquarters, Washington, visiting Britain in 1943, had a bet, made a bet with Portal, that the Wright Pat could take the Spitfire and make a long-range fighter. And the bet was a case of bourbon against a case of this, probably blended Scotch, and single malt Scotch was not thought of much at the time. And actually, 2 Spitfires were taken apart, bundled across the ocean in one of the empty ships that's found, arrived in sometime in early 1944, and in no less than 47 days were turned into long-range fighters that were then, after they had been tested, and yes, the combat capabilities were such and such and such, that were able to fly back to Great Britain and arrive in summer of late spring, early summer of 1944. Portal, the chief of the RAF, said, "My God, what a great surprise. I'm completely surprised," which he should have been, given his arrogant dismissal of such surprise. The crucial point here is that the P-51 was crucial to winning of air superiority. Now let me say a few about the bombing in terms of considerable irony that's happened and sort of reworking the World War II history that's been going on the last 20 years, both in Germany and the United States. From 1940 to 1942, the RAF Bomber Command managed to do nothing. In fact, my comment on its level of accuracy, which was that and the Butt report of summer of 1941 indicated that Bomber Command's aircraft could hit a target area the size of 1/3 of it could only, not 2/3 would miss, target area of 75 square miles. As I commented in my book, Luftwaffe, which appeared in 1983, this meant that Bomber Command, for the first 2 years of its efforts, was killing a lot of cows and blowing a lot of trees up, which did not substantially hurt the German War Army. the result of that could very clearly, in terms of political terms and the resources available without church, have resulted in the end of the night bombing of Germany by the end of 1942. It did not, largely because of Churchill's support. In the bombing that began in spring of 43, the British had solved a lot of their problems. A little bit late, but the bombing of the Ruhr, as the most important book on the German economy ever to appear, war economy, called Wages of Destruction, the only book on economic history that has not put me to sleep. And it takes a lot to put me to sleep. It's a stunning book by a young British historian who's now at Yale named Adam Tooze. Tooze argued that the Battle of the Ruhr, which Bomber Command waged in the spring of 1943, brought the German expansion of the German war economy to a halt, to all intents and purposes. There were some future ups, but very slight, but the huge, massive upswing that occurred between 1941 and the end of 1942 ended. I don't have time to go into all of the results of that, but unfortunately, Bomber Command moved on to other targets, to include Hamburg and then Berlin, the pressure was taken off the German economy. Tooze argued that had the Bomber Command continued just bombing the Ruhr, because of its crucial coal production, that the Germans' economy would have slowly disintegrated in late 43 and 44. While this was occurring, the American effort began in April of 43, and that came close to failing, with the result that the campaign would not have been continued. There were a lot of enemies that were suggesting both the Army and the Navy that these resources could be used far better, either in supporting the Army on the ground or the Navy against German submarines. The best example of that, of course, is from April of 1943 through October of 1943, 8th Air Force crew losses were 30% per month. 30% per month were killed or wounded or captured by the Germans. That's a loss rate that is unsustainable, except for the fact that U.S. industry was turning out bombers, as a British historian has said, like candy bars. What happened is that the P-51 arrived. I don't have time to discuss that, but it arrived in December of 1943. And then there were a series of air battles from February of 1944 through May of 1944 that did, if you will, unintended things. The hope of those bombing attacks was that German industry, air industry, the production of aircraft would be destroyed, and engines production as well would be destroyed. In fact, the irony of that is that it didn't do that. German fighter production increased over that period, although their quality completely collapsed. But then if the airplane's only going to fly 5 minutes, you don't have to worry about having a Mercedes that will last for 20 years. The result of that, however, was the unintended effect was that the air combat between P-51s and German air fighters destroyed the German Air Force and won air superiority over the European continent. Not exactly what the airmen had aimed for and hoped for, but the fact that the Luftwaffe was able to fly only 70 sorties over the Normandy beaches on the 6th of June 1944 was a reflection that the Luftwaffe strength had been broken. And there's a further unintended effect in that by 1944 there were something like 20,000 high-velocity 88, 105, and 120 high-velocity guns firing into the air, not hitting anything for the most part, although they certainly gave U.S. and British pilots a rough time, and somewhere around 500,000 German soldiers deployed to the air defense of Germany against the air offensive. Now again, you know, for those who argue that the air offensives of British Air Force and U.S. Army Air Forces, 8th Air Force and eventually 15th Air Force, killed lots of civilians, was really messy, really terrible, had no humanitarian aspects. All of that completely correct, but that it caused an enormous dislocation, if you will, in German military power. And it doesn't take a rocket scientist to figure out that 10,000 more 88s on in the European fight and additional 200,000 soldiers might have made a much nastier campaign in Western Europe. Let me turn to the planning for D-Day. And again, Eisenhower and Montgomery, I think, played quite a major role in this, because what they basically did when they arrived in England in January of 1944 was they said, the initial planning is completely insufficient. You have allocated 3 divisions and 1 airborne. If we don't have 5 amphibious divisions landing and 3 airborne, it will not succeed. And that required a massive change in priorities for the production of landing craft, pulling stuff away from the Pacific, and concentrating them on the landing in Normandy. That was, again, major food fight, one that both Churchill and Roosevelt played a hand in terms of telling their subordinates that this effort would be made, and if you didn't like it, it was too bad, it was going to occur. The second thing, which Eisenhower and his deputy, British Air Marshal Arthur Tedder, dreamed up, was something called the Transportation Plan, which is aimed at taking out the German transportation network, actually, in this case, the French transportation network and the Belgian transportation network, so that the Germans would not be able to logistically support the forces in Normandy. And this was raised in March of 1944, and again, it led to a major food fight, which would have gone could well have gone the other way. Churchill was appalled, said, "My God, you're going to kill hundreds of thousands of Frenchmen." Bomber Harris, the head of Bomber Command, said, "Oh yes, we will kill hundreds of thousands of Frenchmen." And this is a horrible thing. Bomber Harris didn't know anything about him. At the World of War, however, when he was interviewed about the bombing of French targets, said, "Well, the French deserved everything they got. They ran away in 1940. The worst kind of British, if you will." In this case, he was from Rhodesia, so he was British, but had a slightly different attitude. In the end, what turned out was the Bomber Command's estimates missed the fact that you were not going to send 700 Lancasters and Halifaxes over each target. You were in fact going to use the newly developed tactics the Bomber Command had and send 75 to 100 aircraft to take targets out. And that was something which you could do, and you would result in far less French casualties. And so Churchill was eventually convinced that this was a possibility. A couple of test cases were carried out which proved that Bomber Command had the capability to do that. Worth noting that de Gaulle's attitude when he was asked about would France be willing to take heavy casualties, you know, de Gaulle said, "I don't care how many you kill, it's beating the Germans that matters." And so the French people will delightedly take on the sacrifice. I'm not sure whether every Frenchman would have voted for that, but that was the attitude of their government. Two other crucial elements in terms of the Allied landings. Omaha Beach, as I think most of you know, came perilously close to a disaster. Perilously close. A very few American groups managed to make it up to the cliffs that overlook it. None of the draws were taken on the first day, although they were put into a severe position where they were indefensible because they were being attacked from the rear. And Omaha Beach succeeded by the skin of its teeth. Along these lines, it could have been a much easier ride for the American troops landing because there were two aspects of it that underline, if you will, the sloppiness of Bradley and Hodges in running planning the American effort for Omaha Beach. In March of end of March, early April, General Marshall sent a division commander named Pete Corlett, who had commanded the 7th Army 7th Division in landing at Kwajalein. Now, the landing at Kwajalein was a relatively small and unimportant landing, which was part of the Marshall Islands, the Marianas, the steps towards the Marianas, was supported, a Marine division, an Army division, supported by 7 battleships. 7 battleships for 5 days. The Normandy landings had 2, one at Utah and one at Omaha. And the reason for that is that when Pete Corlett looked at the plan, Marshall had sent him over to Bradley and Hodges to advise them. Corlett said, you don't have nearly enough landing support. You need, instead of 20 minutes of naval gunfire, you need probably an hour, hour and a half at a minimum. And you also need, instead of 2 battle ships, you need about 6 or 7, which is what we had at Kwajalein. And basically, Bradley blew them off. Corlett's memoir said that Bradley's attitude was, what do we need to learn anything from a Bush League theater? Other Americans died because of that kind of sloppy thinking. And so the result was, and here the comparison to British beaches, because Montgomery, who having done a considerable number of landings and watched the Sicily and Italian landings, had managed to get an hour and a half of gunfire support, which is one of the reasons why the British landings succeeded, because they blew the Germans. Now here, in terms of particularly Omaha, we were lucky. And this is where chance, what is the old saw that God takes care of drunks, Irishmen, and the United States of America? There's some lapping over the first two, I guess. Is that the Germans could not make up their mind. The guy who was in command of defending the beaches, Erwin Rommel, understood and argued vociferously because of his experiences against the Brits and the Americans that if you don't stop them on the first day, you lose. Basically, he argued, among other things, that the Hitler-Jugend division be moved from the back areas off of Normandy up to Carentan, where it would have, within a matter of hours, been in play both against Omaha Beach and against the 4th Division at Utah. Both, as a result, I would argue both of those landings might have failed. He was overruled by his commanding officer in the West, Rundstedt, and by Hitler. And Hitler-Jugend was not moved off. It gave a really nasty bloody nose to the Canadians on the 7th of June, and then followed that up with a massive number of atrocities in terms of shooting Canadian prisoners of war. One of the great tragedies of Canadian justice is the fact that having sentenced Meyer to death by hanging, they did not hang him. In fact, he was shipped back to the Germans, who released him from prison after a year or 2. The second case, again in terms of Omaha, is the legend has been that the reason Omaha It was such a difficult time for Americans, troops landing there, half of the 29th Division and half of the Big Red One, was that the Germans had put a brand new, first-class division up that Allied intelligence not pick up, the 352nd. Wrong. There was one battalion from the 352nd, one battalion from the 916th, a really third-class division, and the rest of the division was back. Rommel, in fact, had shown up in the area in terms of his various inspections and had told the commander of the 52nd, who had kept his division back, that he didn't give a damn whether German doctrine said to keep your main forces in reserve. Rommel wanted the entire 352nd up on the cliffs and the beaches, and had the division commander listen to what he had been directly ordered to do by his commander-in-chief, the Big Red One and the 29th would not have landed. Given the importance of Omaha Beach between the 4th Division landing and the British landing, would have been a complete failure. Let me make a few final comments and then we'll open it up for questions. A number of you have walked the beaches of Normandy, and particularly something which I think most American tourists who go to Normandy do, which is that beautiful cemetery overlooking Omaha Beach, and all of the other cemeteries for the Canadians and British soldiers who are buried where they actually fell. In fact, it's a wonderful thing that the British do, which is that they did not, like the Americans, offer families the possibility of bringing their dead sons back to Britain after the war. They just buried them, but they did offer them something which I think is enormously touching. It's made me cry on a number of occasions. The families were offered the chance to put a little statement at the bottom of each grave. Now, many of them did not. Some of them just said the obvious, but some of them just ring at your heart. They are so moving. They kind of hide, if you will, the price of military success, but in the end they do not, because when one walks those graves, one is looking at the fact that most of these individuals were killed who were between the ages of 18 and 25, with none of the chance that we have all enjoyed to raise children, to be married, to do all of the things that I think makes a run of life worthwhile. Their lives ended then with no future possibilities. And I remembered particularly of that wonderful phrase from the Bible, which I think sums up, if you will, the effort at Normandy, of all of the Allied soldiers who died there. All these were honored of their generation and were the glory of their time. With that note, I'll end and take any questions. We have to, what, 7 feet? So we have about 15 minutes. I haven't given many lectures since I left at Ohio State. And at Ohio State, unfortunately, unlike many universities, there were no bells. So the only thing you had was sort of undergraduates invading your classroom at an opportune time. Yes, sir, let me take your question.
I'm really moved by your last couple of paragraphs about the inscriptions on the Brits cemeteries, grave sites. Could you give us a couple of examples of those that moved you so much, please?
I can't remember them. I've never written them down, but anybody who has has been to Normandy should look at those
Yeah.
words. Now, one of the interesting things about the British cemeteries is they collect soldiers from an area, bury them, and if they find 5 or 6 Germans lying around, they throw them in. So one of the things for the 60th anniversary, when the Germans were finally invited to participate in the celebrations, they were not there in 1994, but in 2004 they were invited and showed up. But their chancellor made the very smart decision of laying the German wreath on a German buried in a British cemetery, not on the German cemetery. The German cemetery is so Teutonic and dark. For anybody who's been there, it's you know, one look tells you it's the Germans.
We have a World War II study abroad program, which has now completed its 2nd iteration. And as part of that, the students go to all 3 of the major war cemeteries in Normandy, the German cemetery, the American military cemetery, and the British cemetery. And it's one of the things that they study is how each nation commemorates its war dead, and it's all different in their own ways. The most poignant inscription that I remember from the British cemetery is a couple who clearly lost their only child in Normandy. And it says at the bottom of the headstone, "Into the mosaic of victory, our most precious piece was laid."
Again, I remember seeing that, but the one I saw that made me cry, I couldn't write down, that's why I can't remember.
Do you
Yes,
think the August 17th and 18th, 1943 bombing and the 6-month delay of the A4 had any consequence at all?
Yeah, it had the consequence that the sooner we won air superiority over Europe, the more damage we could have done in the German war economy, both we and the Brits. Once we won air superiority over Germany by September of 1944, Bomber Command was able to bomb in the daytime. Strategic bombers were held, and bombing of Germany was held for the most part in advance from April of 1944 through early September of 1944. But had we won air superiority early, and again, this comes down to, had the Brits had a long-range escort fighter available, they could have won this battle in 1943 because they were turning out huge numbers of Spitfires. It just had to be slightly...
What I was referring to was Peenemünde, where they destroyed the D2 and had a 6-month delay.
Yeah, you're talking about the British raid rather than the American raid.
August 17th and 18th of 43.
Yeah, I was gonna mention that. The interesting thing is that the British official history claims that Bomber Command's only mistake they made, I don't know why they made it, that Bomber Command could not have supported the American bombing of Schweinfurt on the 17th of August because there was too much moon. And yet that's the night that they took out Peenemünde. And it had a considerable effect on the Germans. I would argue that as important in terms of its impact on the Germans was the crossbow, the efforts to prevent the Germans from launching V1 attacks earlier than they did. They did not start launching V1 attacks until after the landings had taken place. Had they started those in substantial numbers earlier, they might well have really presented a real problem.
Thank you.
Over here, Doctor.
Doctor, other than his statement to Marshall that he couldn't stand the thought of Marshall being gone from Washington, what are there other reasons? What reasons do you attribute Roosevelt's decision to select Eisenhower over Marshall to lead the command?
I think Roosevelt said it quite accurately that Marshall was the only person who could control King or the president, and Marshall made every effort to ensure that his relationship to King was always cordial and always on the same mark. I think Roosevelt understood, again, I think Larrabee's book on American senior commanders is very sophisticated in its discussion of the interrelationship. Doesn't get everything right, but it's, I think, a wonderful book of interpersonal relationships, which in the Second World War were just as fractious as any interpersonal relations of any group of people working 20 hours a day, 7 days a week, and fully capable of antagonizing everybody, including their own staff. I think that Roosevelt understood. Now, the other part of it is, again, in terms of Roosevelt's understanding, I think he understood that Eisenhower had this wonderful political capacity to get along and see the political aspects of the war in a clear fashion. So the broad front strategy, which, you know, on one hand, the Brits supporting Marshall have argued about for 60 years, and those supporting Patton for 60 years have argued for. What Eisenhower understood was that you couldn't do either one, because if you had supported the British drive in the North, the American press would have been outraged, and if you'd supported Patton, the British press would have been outraged. And the political necessities of alliance, which was crucial not only to the winning of the Second World War, but to rebuilding Europe and rebuilding the alliances necessary for the Cold War. And that's something that Eisenhower understood. Again, I think the more we look at Eisenhower, the more one is struck by the man's innate intelligence and capacity to understand, if you will, the broader strategic and political questions. As I said, in the war to be won, in the end, you really have great sympathy for Eisenhower, who was stuck with this dysfunctional group of brilliant commanders who hated and squabbled and stabbed each other in the back and acted like little children and called Eisenhower a dumb cluck, almost to his face. Sometimes to his face, as Montgomery did. And that's the one time where Eisenhower literally, Montgomery's chief of staff went to his boss and said, if you don't go to Eisenhower and snivel and say how sorry you are and do everything, you're going to be fired. Because Eisenhower would go to his back and go to Churchill and say, him or me. And there would have been no doubt which way Churchill was going. And so again, and we're understanding in terms of Eisenhower's presidency, both he and Truman come across as these incredibly sophisticated, calling Harry Truman sophisticated is a very difficult thing to do. Harry Truman was a deep student of history. And to be a deep student of history, you don't have to be a history major. He read history books all his life, and he understood history. The period from 1960 to 1980 in terms of American presidency is a gloomy, dark one. And then Reagan came along, and whatever you think of his politics and economics, his running of the foreign policy of the United States was brilliant. Again, I didn't make the
I think we have time for one more question.
Thank you. I wish you could tell me if this story I heard is true. It was a meeting of the combined chiefs of staff. I don't know where, but all the British admirals and field marshals were there. Marshall, King, and all the American admirals were arguing various strategies. And supposedly, King got so mad at Field Marshal Allen Brooke that he tried to leap across the table and pop him. Did that really happen? And you know where it happened?
Basically, what one of the commentators said was King was so mad, and you could tell, and this was somebody who knew King well, you could tell when King really got mad, it turned red, and shirt collar was about to pop, but nobody had to hold him back. He was too smart to understand it. Leaping across the table and strangling Brooke, who didn't deserve to be strangled. His memoirs it's one of those memoirs that really has led to the drop in the estimation of his understanding and capabilities. But the story's there. My doubt is that King would have gone so far, although I think large numbers of people, including British officers, would have been delighted to see him do that. Take one more, well, we got, I think we got, for the clock up here, we got 5 more minutes. Take a question back here. We got I'm deaf, so you don't want to try and shout a question up at me.
Could you sketch out the course of the war had the Normandy invasion failed? Not only absolute, but you know, the kind of things that would float, if we had tried again, what would the Russians have done, that kind of thing.
I think,
And do it in 2 minutes or less.
I think we would have tried again. I think the result of that would have been the dropping of the atomic bomb on Berlin, which would have had a huge impact on future American-German relations. You know, this is one of those things where, and again, Eisenhower wrote that wonderful statement about if it had failed, and it came close in terms of the knife's edge. Although at the end of the day, you know, we got 155,000 troops ashore, and we were basically in the position we wanted to be because the Germans had not done a number of things which might have made it less chance of success. I think we would probably have tried to make some sort of a major landing, which we did anyway in southern France, just simply to indicate that we could, you know, impose it. But it would have had a catastrophic impact on British attitudes and American attitudes towards the war. It didn't fail, thank God, for everybody. Again, one of the things that historian Gerhard Weinberg has pointed out is that the ending of the war as soon as possible was absolutely essential because every day that it went on, including the war in the Pacific, this is Max Hastings' book on the Pacific, which is underlooked on that American authors and Japanese authors, which have talked about the dropping of the bomb saved a huge number of Japanese from what would have happened, and a large number of Americans' lives were saved, but also saved a huge number of Chinese, Australian lives, and lives throughout Southeast Asia, including a book which I recommend, the best memoir of the Second World War by MacDonald Fraser, Quartered Safe Out Here, which is, if you haven't read it, truly one of the great books written memoirs.
What's that again? Say that book again.
Quartered Safe Out Here. MacDonald Fraser is the author of the Flashman novels, but he was a lance corporal in Burma in Slim's army, and his comment is on Slim. When you have corporals writing this, you get a sense of why Slim is considered one of the great generals of the Second World War. MacDonald Fraser said, when General Slim talked to the veterans of the 14th Army, he never said, I did, rarely, if ever, said, we did, and almost always said, you did. That's right. Good leader.
Thank you, Wick, for an outstanding talk. Before we disperse for the evening, let me remind you that the conference will continue tomorrow morning. If you haven't picked up a program yet, I encourage you to do so on the way out. Take note that we'll reconvene at 7:30 in the morning for coffee, and then the first lecture will begin promptly at 8 o'clock. Please also note that the conference will start tomorrow not in this building, but in Haggerty Hall, which is 3 buildings that way toward High Street to the east. The coffee will be in the lobby outside of the lecture hall there, and then the lecture will begin in Haggerty 180. Thank you for your presence this evening. Please join me once again in acknowledging Professor Murray's excellent talk.